Hello. The Family from Eden is a series of programs about the early history of the earth, as recorded in the Bible. And today we shall examine the claim that the earliest population lived for many hundreds of years. In most languages there is an expression, old as Methuselah. And the Bible tells us that Methuselah was the oldest person who ever lived. He became 969 years old, and we shall see if we can believe this. The oldest written history is often rejected as myth and fancy tales, because they are simply unbelievable. But with this attitude, it's impossible to learn from them. The ancient epic poems of Homer, the Odyssey and the Iliad, were also considered as fiction, until Heinrich Schliemann, the archaeologist, took them seriously and was able to find the ancient Troy in Asia Minor. Such old stories can draw a picture that may give a better understanding of history. In the Bible, it was not only Methuselah that got old. Most of his contemporaries lived more than 900 years, right from Adam and Eve until Noah, a period of 10 generations and approximately 1600 years. When the great flood came and covered the earth, it changed everything, even the life expectancy. Now, the ages of these people in the Bible can be interpreted in different ways. And some reject them outright, but others believe that the numbers refer to months, or that there is an error in the decimals. Others claim that man was meant to live forever, and that the long lifespan is to be understood as a transition to today's lifespan. Some believe that the environment on Earth caused the process of aging to go much more slowly. So the Bible is where we read about the 969-year-old Methuselah, and I wanted to learn more about this. You will probably be regarded as crazy if you believe that someone could be almost 1,000 years old. But let us still examine the matter a little more, and perhaps we can find an explanation. There is a dictionary that says that some biblical interpreters solve this problem in the way that they find satisfactory, by claiming that the year that the biblical author meant is not as long as a year is for us. This is an opinion that we shall keep in mind as we look further. This age was very different from our own time, and we probably wouldn't recognize anything there. The Bible seems to say that all the continents were connected in one great landmass, and the mountains were not very high. It had never rained due to a large body of water that God had placed around the earth, and the ground got its water from springs and the morning dew. Scientists agree that there was much more oxygen in the early atmosphere. Analysis of air bubbles trapped in amber show that oxygen level was nearly twice as high as it is today. And the level of CO2 was also higher, making the conditions for plants, animal, and people very favorable. Even with very little information about this early period, we do find some interesting details that may help us to understand more. And some information is found in the Bible, and other details come from the Book of Jubilees. So let's first see who were these people and how old were they. The first one was Adam, and he lived to be 930. And his son Seth lived 912 years. Now Seth had a son Enosh, who became 905 years old, and then came Canaan with 910 years, Mahalalel with 895, and Jared with 962. And then came Enoch, who was taken away by God when he was only 365 years old. The next was Enoch's son, Methuselah, who was the oldest of them all, with 969 years. At his birth, 7 generations of his ancestors were still alive. So 8 generations lived together. And this is very difficult to imagine for us. But if people today had children soon after puberty, a similar situation would arise. Methuselah was the father of Lamech, who became 777. And this was the year that a great flood came. But both Lamech and his father died shortly before the water broke loose on the earth. His first son was named Noah and built the ark that saved mankind through the great flood. And this happened when Noah was 600 years old. Almost 1700 years had passed after God created Adam and Eve. So let's have a closer look at the recorded numbers and see if we can understand what happened and why people were 900 years then and only 90 today. The diagram I show you here shows each person from birth to grave represented by a line that rises as they grow older. We see when they were born, how old they became, and we can also see who were living at the same time. The average life expectancy before the flood was 926 years. And later this dropped to a sixth, or around 170 years over a few generations. Abraham lived 10 generations later, and he became 175 years old. But measured against today's life expectancy, the ratio is 1 to 10. And in the span of a long life, several factors may affect the lifespan. The environment, the food, and diseases all may influence how long we live. And the climate has also become less hospitable and more unstable. There is less oxygen and CO2 nowadays, factors that may contribute to a reduced lifespan. But we know too little about this to quantify it. There have been biological experiments conducted where plants and insects live in a controlled atmosphere similar to that of the young Earth. And it confirms that the early atmosphere was beneficial for a long life. A surprising result was also that this atmosphere stimulated the ability of organisms to heal themselves. Carbon dioxide, or CO2, is food for plants. Through the photosynthesis, oxygen is released into the atmosphere, and without it, we would all die. But with a much lower content of carbon dioxide in the air nowadays, you can realize that plant life was more abundant in the beginning, and the fossil material also confirms this. And I believe that much of the early CO2 from the atmosphere was trapped in coal, oil, and gas during the flood. Now, an interesting detail in this old story is how old they were when they had their first children. Adam and Eve were 70 years old when they had Cain, and Abel was born in 75, and then came their first sister Avon in 80, according to the book of Jubilees. And in 98, Cain killed his brother, and then there was a long period of mourning because death had become a reality. But later on, Eve again got pregnant and had Seth in the year 130, followed by another daughter, Azura, 7 years later. The time that passes from the time children are born until they have children of their own is a physiological process that is controlled by our genes, and environmental factors have less influence. None of those mentioned had children before they were 65 to 70 years old. And the corresponding figure today could be 12 to 13 years. And strangely enough, again we meet this factor of 6 between the two eras. I was surprised when I met this factor of 6 once more, because things seem to have taken 6 times longer when the earth was young. The life expectancy dropped to 1/6 after the flood, And they also seem to have reached puberty when they were 6 times older than young people are today. But then I found that there is even more information buried in these texts that support this conclusion. The time between each child that was born in the family was approximately 6 years. And in those days there was certainly very little effort made to avoid having children. And when the text says that there were 6 years between children, it can correspond to a year between births today. And again, there is this factor of 6. So we have 3 independent observations that point to the same conclusion. The years went 6 times faster when the earth was young. Now, after all, the Bible tells us that the word of 2 or 3 witnesses makes every matter established. So we have 3 independent observations that agree, and a question now seems inevitable. Was perhaps the year for them only 1/6 of what it is for us today? And I find this very likely. They were not much older than us, but since the year was shorter, they lived a greater number of years. The last diagram I showed was the lifespan for the first 10 generations on Earth. And let us now also include what happened after the flood. The lifespan went through a dramatic change during the event of the flood. Before the flood, most lived more than 900 years, and half was the maximum after the flood. The flood seems to have compressed both the passage of time and the life expectancy. The gap between generations was much less, and so was the life expectancy. It is as if time itself had slowed down. Both periods are described in the same story, found in the same book. All of this comes from the same book. 3 different and independent factors prove that the passage of time changed by a factor of 6 during the flood. I can find no other explanation for this than that the length of the year had changed, exactly as the encyclopedia suggested. A year was much shorter before the flood. Now, the length of a year is the time it takes for the Earth to orbit once around the Sun. The young Earth must have had an orbit that was much closer to the Sun than it is today. The year was shorter because it took less time to circle the Sun. The orbit of the young Earth must have been close to Venus or Mercury, and these planets are closest to the Sun and have the shortest year. I believe that just a few thousand years ago the Earth was orbiting closer to the Sun, and the year was only 1/6 of what it is today. We may think that the Earth circles in a fixed orbit and always has, but the path of our orbit is not stable. The astronomers Copernicus, Newton, and Kepler, they found rules that describe the planetary movements. And other scientists were more concerned with the stability of the orbits, looking for forces that could be binding the planets to their orbits. And famous scientists like Ptolemy, Laplace, and Lagrange studied this question, but they failed to find any such mechanism. And now we know that the orbit of the Earth changes slightly all the time. The surface of the Earth has many craters caused by meteorites, just like the Moon. And celestial bodies occasionally enter the Earth's atmosphere, but most burn up because of friction in the atmosphere. But larger objects may hit the ground, and they will make craters. And each impact of this kind will affect our orbit. And I find it likely that a major collision like this moved the Earth to a new orbit with a longer year. This was a very powerful impact that nearly caused the extinction of all life. And the surface of the Earth was broken, creating new continents and mountain ranges. The Israeli scientist Immanuel Velikovsky was convinced that the Earth had experienced several collisions that changed its orbit. And he wrote 3 books about such lesser-known events in the history of the Earth. And he compared astronomical observations from cultures all over the world. And these stories very often confirmed each other. A change in the Earth's orbit may also explain other unsolved problems. Many scientists believe that the sun heats up with time. The young sun was much cooler than today, and they have no explanation for how life could have survived on the Earth when it was young. It should have been far too cold. All water should have been frozen. But the fact of a later ice age is also a mystery. But an event like the one we describe here can explain both of these mysteries. Because at the time when the Earth was orbiting closer to the sun, it was not burning hot because the solar energy was lower. But still the water did not freeze because of the proximity to the sun. In the Book of the Upright, we read that the farmland gradually dried up before the flood. And towards the great flood, the earth became warmer, and this was probably because the sun radiated more heat. A famine was developing all over the earth. But then came the flood. And in a new orbit, the temperature dropped rapidly. And the change must have been quite dramatic. A severe chill resulted, and some animal species were unable to cope and died out. And in the next episode, we shall see that the rain during the Great Flood contributed to the low temperatures and introduced the Ice Age. The Earth now maintained a lower temperature for generations, and the Ice Age continued for hundreds of years, and perhaps it even continues today. The ice at the poles in Greenland and large areas of tundra appears to be remnants from the Great Ice Age. And I find it exciting that the Bible describes events so accurately and with so many details that we can draw scientific conclusions from them. And there is more material to study if you are interested. And many theories exist about planetary collisions in the past, and several such events are also recorded in the Bible. The sun is said to have changed its course on 2 occasions. And the 10th chapter of the book of Joshua records such an event. And Velikovsky wrote about it in his books. In today's episode, we have looked at the period when Methuselah lived, and he was older than any other human in history. I find this story credible, and I have presented a possible explanation. And when you hear that someone is as old as Methuselah, then you know some of the background. But I admit that not all is explained. For example, how was it possible for Noah to live 950 years when 1/3 of his life was lived after the flood? It doesn't quite add up, and I don't have any answer. But our time is up for now. The next time we shall discuss the great flood or deluge in Noah's time. What was it that happened? Where did all the water come from? And where did the water go after the flood? This is quite exciting. But for now, I say thank you, God bless you, and goodbye.